That seems to be characteristic of successful writers is the discipline to sit down at 6 in the morning or 7:30 or 8, whatever it is, and to have a schedule where they do it.
Life's Third Act is a podcast dedicated to helping you get the most out of your retirement. Sponsored by TuckerAllen. Here's Attorney-CPA Joe Cordell.
Welcome to another episode of Life's Third Act. This week we're going to talk about Michael Crichton. How many of you do not know that name? I will confess that I was familiar with the works and the achievement of this person, but I didn't know, I'd heard the name, but I couldn't, if asked before preparing for this show, who had written Jurassic Park and other well-known things, which we'll talk about in a few moments, some of the other shows he's involved in. But I wouldn't have known the answer to that question. Maybe there are a few of you like me, but I suspect I'm in a very small minority. So fortunately, Marlea is very familiar with this figure and has done some research to prepare this. I've, of course, prepared for this and learned a lot of very interesting things about this person who died in 2008 and left a lot of money behind, but the story's very interesting. So we'll walk you through it, and as we always do on this series, we'll talk a little bit about the good things. We'll talk about mistakes. What can we learn? So Marlea, why don't you get us started with Michael Crichton?
Yeah, if you're definitely not familiar with his name, you're definitely familiar with his work, like you said.
Yes.
Jurassic Park was one of his biggest. But Michael Crichton was born in Chicago in 1942, not very far away from us. And his parents moved him to Long Island in Roslyn, New York, and he was raised there. And he came from just a very humble background. His dad was a journalist. His mom was a homemaker. And, I think they raised him like any normal child. He was very well educated. He spoke about his hometown. He said there was nowhere like it. It was very calm, very peaceful. There wasn't a lot of crime or anything like that.
So a very positive childhood.
Yes, a very positive childhood. And then he went on to Harvard, to be an English major, but he actually decided against that when he had a bit of a falling out with one of the professors. The professor was grading him really below average for his writing skills, and he just thought, the professor doesn't like me. So he kind of tried a little bit of an experiment, and we'll kind of see this in the future. He's very smart. He very much notices people, their behaviors. That's why he's able to write so many well-known novels and
I think
shows.
a lot of good writers do that.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that his dad was a writer.
Yes, he's very much a people person, but he picked up on his professor not liking him, and he thought, okay, well, he hasn't outwardly said it, so let me try something. And he submitted an essay written by George Orwell, and the professor didn't catch on to it, and the professor graded it a B-. And so Crichton was like, if you're going to grade George Orwell a B-, why am I even
that
here?
Was really mischievous.
Yeah.
I can see how the professor, with egg on his face, resented that all the more.
Yeah. And so Michael was like, no, I'm not gonna do this, but I want to stay at Harvard. And then he went on to get his medical degree. And then he got like 2 weeks into medical school, and he was like, this is not for me. I don't like this. He's like, nobody likes medical school. Even the practicing happy physicians don't like it.
Everything you build for you and your family deserves protecting. All of those important assets you have worked so hard to acquire and enjoy, you want to make sure they're handled with care. At TuckerAllen, our attorneys will customize an estate plan that will work for you and your family's goals and needs. TuckerAllen, estate planning, probate, and trust administration. Visit TuckerAllen.com.
But he completed it.
He did complete it. So he completed it. He got his degree, could have been a doctor, and we never would have gotten any of his works, but he instead decided to pursue writing.
And yet he knew in his first year that he wasn't going to practice medicine.
Yeah, I think he was just kind of the guy that saw stuff through.
Yeah.
he wrote all of his novels very quickly. He would lock himself in a room, and he did a lot of work with like shamans and everything in the early stages of his writings. And he was very spiritual. And so when he got into his work, he shut everybody out. He did his work. He completed his drafts of a novel in 6 to 7 weeks, which is just beyond me because Jurassic Park is a work of art, and so are many of his other novels. And I think he was just super driven. I don't think he wanted to give up on things, and I think a lot of his projects have been seen through. A lot of his projects are still being seen through. He's got a book slated to publish in 2024. So James Patterson is finishing up that draft.
Oh, I see. So some of his projects, others are picking up.
Yeah.
That's interesting that he had that sort of work ethic. That seems to be characteristic of successful writers, is the discipline to sit down at 6 in the morning or 7:30 or 8, whatever it is, and to have a schedule where they do it.
Yeah.
And the idea, and I've heard writers talk about this, we tend to think that you wait for inspiration. And the best writers that I've heard talk about this say, no, you sit down and you commit to spending 4 hours, giving it your full attention and doing it religiously. I mean, those are the people who tend to be successful. So I guess the fact that he thought he was able to think in technical terms too, because some of his novels require some research.
Yeah. So, I mean, all of his novels, you'll see that they all have something to do with science, sci-fi, technology. He didn't really stray from any of that, never wrote, any like love romance novels or anything like that. But even in his movies, TV shows, it was all very technical. He is known for ER, the big.
I do remember that.
Yeah.
I didn't watch ER, but boy, was that big.
Yeah, the big show that it reminds me of Grey's Anatomy. They're kind of similar, but I watched it a teeny tiny bit. But it was from 1992 to 2009, which is crazy for a show to run that long.
It's a long run.
Yeah. But he brought a lot of technical aspects to that, and I think a lot of people appreciated that because around that time, you don't find many medical shows with actual correct terminology. Nowadays you do because they actually do their research, but he brought all of that to it.
And he also, I read that another thing that was that accounted for the show's success, and then you saw it imitated by other shows, was to have a lot of things going on, which really reflected a real emergency room, which doubtlessly he spent some time in during his residency or whatnot at least. So to have a show in which you have 5 subplots, and things moving on, you can see how, particularly for today's viewer, that really pulls you in.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, Jurassic Park, the book itself, had all of those subplots because we were following multiple different people around the park. But yeah, he was a very great writer. He had over 200 million copies published and bought, and then he had over a dozen of his movies and shows turn into a dozen of his books turn into actual movies and shows.
Westworld was his too.
Yes.
And did you see Westworld?
I didn't, but I know it's a big sci-fi one. It's got a couple of big names in it. I know that people loved it. I need to go watch it. So.
Yeah, and I'm confusing that with Waterworld.
Yeah.
That's a different deal.
Yeah.
Kevin Costner, I think, was in that.
Yep. But I mean, even today, the Jurassic Park movies still live on. They just completed the 3rd of the new series of remaking it, and
I think I read that even at the time of his death, that the year after he died, I think it was projected that he would have earned like $100 million from the projects that he had pending.
Yeah.
I mean, he was very prolific and very, very profitable. The cash flow that came from these projects.
And I mean, we'll get into this, but even his estate has to be gaining money from all of this still. Jurassic Park isn't a thing that's left, it's still very around. Even Twister, he wrote and produced Twister, and they're doing a remake of that, and
that has a cult following.
Yeah.
I mean, there are people who just
Twister,
go
though.
on and on about that show, kind of like Blade Runner in a way.
Yeah, Twister was one of those ones that I saw when I was really young, and then it made me believe that I had to like open all the windows and fill up the bathtubs and everything when a tornado came through.
Justin, let me ask you. You strike me as somebody who would know something about Blade Runner.
Yeah.
Why did I guess that right?
I love that movie.
What about Twister?
Honestly, I haven't seen Twister in probably 20 years.
Okay.
I like it.
Yeah. I mean, it still continues to.
Yeah.
I look at the rental schedule and it's very popular.
We had a big role from one of our previous topics.
Yep, Philip Seymour Hoffman.
Oh, yeah. Philip Seymour Hoffman was that. That was one of his early. That was the first sign of talent, some say. He played the eccentric character.
Yeah.
Predictably. So, okay. So let's talk about his personal life.
Yeah, so he was married 5 times, which is a lot. I think that it was very hard for him to find somebody that could deal with a writer, just because, like he'd hide himself away for 6 to 7 months.
And he was kind of private, wasn't
yes,
he?
he's very private. As we'll go on to see, he also collected a lot of art, but nobody ever knew the extent of what he collected or how much until after his death. So I can only assume from there that he had a lot of other, really private hobbies. People probably didn't know him a whole lot beyond his works, and I think he liked it that way. So I think that's why he went, through so many marriages, just because he was probably shut off from a lot of people.
Yeah, and even though his name is familiar to, I'm assuming, a substantial majority, but the fact that I don't know of him, and I kind of take pride in reading a lot. I knew the name, but I couldn't have told you, specifically connected him with Jurassic Park, for example. I mean, it's a reflection of somebody that great and that famous in a sense of the word, but yet not a household word.
Yes.
And he didn't promote himself. He wasn't a self-promoter like Truman Capote. I mean, Truman Capote, man, anytime he got near a camera or a microphone, he used the occasion, and he did outlandish things, and he used the occasion to draw attention to himself and his work. This is not Michael Crichton.
Yeah, I think he just loved to do what he did, and I don't think he liked the fame from it. Even in his earlier works, he wrote under a pseudonym, under multiple pseudonyms, but he just didn't really care about what came with it. I think he just wanted his thoughts out into the world, which a lot of good writers, that's exactly what they are, and that's what makes them wonderful. They just want people to know what they're thinking is basically what it is, and they don't really care beyond that.
Yeah, you're right. It does. Their works kind of speak for themselves, and you can see how you might be very opinionated artistically or otherwise, and you figure I'm writing books or I'm painting pictures or I'm making music.
Yeah.
My message is there, so you don't feel, you have that way of venting without going onto an interview format or other public venues to speak directly to it. And it's also less confrontational to do it that way.
And I mean, yeah, he won lots and lots of awards, but that was honestly unbeknownst to me until I looked him up, because I don't think he showed up to accept a lot of the awards, or he didn't want it publicized. Like I told you, he had a dinosaur named after him, and I had no idea about that either, which I think that is, that's better than any award to me. That's so cool.
And it's a reflection of the fact that he did seek to be realistic. He did do the research to try to, even though the plots themselves may be fantastic, still the research behind and the behavior and the assumptions about the particular species they talked about, Tyrannosauruses and others, and the raptors. Yeah. I remember some of these names. That's a product of bona fide scientific studies, so I think they felt comfortable naming
even how they got the dinosaur DNA. He backed it with a bit of science, and I won't say we could 100% do that, but
give us another 20 years.
There was a really big debate when all of the new ones were coming out about how we couldn't do that unless we had this, and this, but it was still backed by scientific fact. I mean, if we had, like you said, another 20 years, maybe that could happen. And I think he was just very futuristic in all of that. A lot of his stuff, it wasn't just like flying cars. It wasn't anything that was the typical futuristic.
It wasn't fantasy stuff.
No,
he tried to connect it to ground it somehow.
Yes. Yeah.
So he wasn't very old when he passed away. Let's talk about what leading up to it. What was the state of his marriage at that time?
Yeah, so he had been remarried to his fifth wife, Sherry. They were pregnant at the time. She was about 6 months pregnant. He did have a daughter from a previous marriage, Taylor, and she was around 20. Sherry and him, and this will be important, as we get talking about the estate, they did sign a prenup, and she signed that she didn't have, any rights to his estate if he passed away. I don't think he expected to honestly have a child with her. So as we'll see, I think that might be one of the reasons as to why he didn't change his will. But he had his daughter included in it, and he died from throat cancer in 2008 at a pretty young age.
So they married, is a short marriage, I think, to 2005.
Yeah, it was.
So they're married like 3 years. We don't know that at the time he did his estate planning, which was a year before he died, we don't know whether he knew about that child. We have to assume he didn't.
Yeah.
Because the child was 6. As a matter of fact, he couldn't have, because the child was 6 months in utero at the time he died. So he couldn't have known. But what's interesting, the more interesting question, I think, and this is relevant to the discussions about who takes, in a case like this, what claim might a child have in a case like this, is whether he, in fact, knew about the child at the time of his death. And it cuts both ways depending on how you answer that question. If you answer that he knew and he didn't scurry to amend or revise his estate planning, then that seems to suggest that it was willful to not include that child. You could, on the other hand, say that he was sick, he had knowledge, but he was at the latter stages of his cancer, and it must have been, by the time this cancer was discovered, I suspect that it was pretty far along. It could have been, and again, these things aren't public because of the very personality you're describing. We don't know a lot about this. It wasn't reported at the time. It's possible he had had a diagnosis of cancer at the time he did his estate planning the year before in 2007. So in any case, though, if we assume he found out about the child, his death would be even more imminent. It probably is the better argument that is in favor of his consciously excluding the child. Why would he do that? I mean, I agree. Why would he? But so let's set some context here. So we have the stage set. We have a child that's 20 years old from a prior marriage. We have a prenuptial agreement with Sherry. And we have this child in utero, 6 months in utero at the time of his death. So he created his will and trust in 2008, which was 2007, which was, there are some things that you wonder why they weren't done, but he did do significant estate planning. There was a living trust. Doubtlessly, there were assets transferred into that trust, that's important to avoid probate. And those are the assets we don't know about because, remember, they're private. So the ones that went into probate, we know about that. Now, the estimates of the estate were around $175 million. That's probably low for the reasons that you can't project really what's going to flow from this intellectual property over time. So there doubtlessly will be royalties of some sort, other payments. But the best estimate was $175 million. I would suspect that over time it'll be double that. Yeah. These projects continue to go in his name. So the nice thing about copyright law or intellectual property law is it's 70 years, or it's a lifetime plus 70 years. So, he died at age 66. So there potentially is another 70 years of coverage for his intellectual property that his family would enjoy from any of these works he did. And think of the remakes that might occur.
Yeah, and I know a lot of like directors, like Spielberg. He's still doing like some of his movies. Obviously, he directed all of Jurassic Park, and I know that he's been putting Crichton's name on them. So I'm assuming that would fall under his work, even if So
yeah, that's right. So name, likeness, any branded material. Those are all things for which you'd be entitled to compensation if you're the holder of the copyrights. So intellectual property in other forms, photographs, etc. So I think that we're talking about a lot more here, and we just don't know, again, partially because a substantial part of the assets, I'm assuming, went into the living trust, the revocable trust. Now, another point that bothers me about this whole scenario is that a lot of the taxes that doubtlessly were paid on this estate could have been avoided. This comes up a lot when we do these shows. Not all the time, but they come up a lot. I think that sometimes people figure that wealthy people, especially artists, actors, others, may feel that, look, there's a lot of money here, more than my children will ever need to spend, whether they want to spend it or not. They don't need to spend any more than this. And so I'll pay, if I pay 40% to the IRS, so what? There's plenty left. That's a judgment call, people who think that way. Others, tend to think no matter how much money they have, that it's almost their duty to give as little to the federal government as possible. I'm closer to that position. So if that were the case, I think that he could have done a lot more. My suspicion is that because this diagnosis probably had come along, it seems too coincidental.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the resources that I've read, they state it as a sudden death, but I don't think for him, like you said, it was sudden. I think he found out a while back, but I don't think that was all coincidental because
it was sudden to the public.
Yeah,
maybe.
It was sudden to the public, and I mean he purposely wrote his wife out of the will, not wrote her out, but made her sign a prenup to saying she wasn't an heir. So there's a big tax break there with marriage and so on and so forth. And then he only had his daughter included. And as we'll see, he didn't really have anywhere else for a lot of his personal effects to go. He didn't really write anything in for, what he wanted to happen to them. He was just like, okay, well, she's going to get this money and then we're just going to be okay with that. So
Yeah, you're right that the fact that there's a prenup and the wife gets nothing, you kind of waste what would be an exemption there of $5+ million. But the prenup, I understand why he did it, and we'll assume he did that in 2005. And otherwise it'd be a postnup. So we'll assume that this was done in 2005. And essentially with a standard prenup, it's not unusual, it's typical that the person who's signing it, they will waive any claim to, either party will waive any claim to the other's estate, directly or indirectly. So there's often very tight language that suggests that wants to head off any claim to any source of income, management of estate, etc. So if that was prepared with the sort of particularity that these things often are, then you can see how it became an issue that after he passed away and suddenly his Sherry was in a position of being able to manage some of the assets as essentially the guardian, as well as I think she may have been personal representative of the estate. Typically a wife will be, doesn't have to be, but often that happens. But especially in the guardianship role, would have been in a position to manage any assets that went to this unborn child. So if the courts determined that the unborn child had a claim to part of this estate, which we'll come to in just a second, then the question became, wait, doesn't that put her in position of managing a substantial part of the estate? So some suggested maybe this is going to run afoul of the prenuptial agreement, which often is to head off any way in which a clever lawyer can invade part of the inheritance of your children from your first marriage. Typically is often when these come up. So it turns out, though, that kind of the parties walked past that. And I think that maybe it was decided that it was just an additional war that wasn't worth fighting. So what happened was, understandably, the child from the 20-year-old child Her name is?
Taylor.
Taylor. So Taylor brings an action, her attorneys bring an action immediately after to assert that this child, unborn child, does not have a claim. And the basis of that action is that in this case, there was very specific language in the will. We know what the will says. Remember, it's publicly filed. There's very specific language in the will that said that anybody I've not named here, it's deliberate. So you can take the exclusion of any otherwise heir as my deliberate decision to exclude them. So we're going to break here because we're breaking this into 2 shows. So just go to the next show to see this conversation continue. Another episode of Life's Third Act.
You've been listening to Life's Third Act, a podcast for thriving in retirement, sponsored by TuckerAllen, your estate and elder law advisors. Each week, we discuss topics and answer questions to help you better plan for your future. For more information, visit TuckerAllen.com. Subscribe and listen again next week for another edition of Life's Third Act. The choice of a lawyer is an important decision and should not be based solely on advertisements.